So, we are starting in Joshua 9, and let's read verses 1 and 2. That came about when all the kings who were beyond the Jordan, in the hill country, and in the lowland, and in all the coast of the great sea, that would be the Mediterranean, toward Lebanon, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite heard of it, that they gathered themselves together with one accord to fight with Joshua and with Israel. Right? So after the battle of Ai and after the battle of Jericho, it becomes fairly obvious to the Canaanite people that if they don't come up with a coalition, that they're going to be done in city by city and area by area by Israel. So they form a coalition together. Now, I want you to remember, keep your hand in Joshua, but turn back to first Deuteronomy chapter 7. We've read it, but I want to read it again. I want to read a few verses in Deuteronomy 7 and then a few verses in Deuteronomy 20. So Deuteronomy 7, verses 1 and 2. Important that we keep this in mind as we go into this chapter. So starting in verse 1 of Deuteronomy 7, when the Lord your God shall bring you into the land where you are entering to possess it, and shall clear away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and stronger than you. And when the Lord your God shall deliver them before you, you shall defeat them. Then you shall utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them and show no favor to them. Okay? And turn over a little bit further, Deuteronomy 20. I'm going to read verses 10 through 15. When you approach a city to fight against it, you shall offer it terms of peace. And it shall come about, if it agrees to make peace with you and opens to you, then it shall be that all the people who are found in it shall become your forced labor and shall serve you. However, if it does not make peace with you, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. Then the Lord your God, when the Lord your God gives it into your hand, you shall strike all the men in it with the edge of the sword. Only the women and the children and the animals and all that is in the city, all of its spoil, you shall take as booty for yourself. And you shall use the spoil of your enemies, which the Lord your God has given to you. Thus you shall do to all the cities that are, underline these words, very far from you, which are not of the cities of the nations nearby. So, summarize. What are the conditions that have been laid down for Israel as they come into the land?
You may summarize.
Yeah, summarize. What was this say?
Well, peace with them.
7 nations they were to destroy.
Right.
And the ones who are far away, if they agree to make peace, to make this.
Right. So the 7 Amorite nations, no peace. Unconditional, gone. All right? Other cities, other nations, other than the 7 that are outside, in a way, they can make peace with them if they surrender.
But no kindness.
Okay? All right? Okay. Now, let's read verses 3 through 5 of Joshua 9. When the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they also acted craftily and sent out envoys and took worn-out sacks on their donkeys and wineskins, worn out and torn and mended, and worn out and patched sandals on their feet, and worn out clothes on themselves, and all the bread of their provision was dry and become crumbled. Now, Gibeon, interestingly enough, if you can see it up there, here is, well, it doesn't show us where Ai is, I guess, on this map. But basically, Gibeon is all of 7 miles from Ai. All right, so they're a local part of the Amorite nation. Gibeon are considered to be, there you go, Gibeon are considered to be in the clan or group of the Hivites.
Okay.
So they're 7 miles away from where they just won this battle. So they devise a grand deception by wearing worn out shoes, worn out clothes, carrying worn out baggage, having old dried bread and old food. Therefore, they're giving the impression that they've traveled from a long distance. Okay? Therefore, instead of fighting, they devise a deception. This is their strategy. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Now let's read verses 6 through 10. And they went to Joshua at the camp at Gilgal, and said to him and to the men of Israel, We have come from a far country. Now therefore make a covenant with us. And the men of Israel said to the Hivites, Perhaps you are living within our land. How then shall we make a covenant with you?
Mm-hmm.
But they said to Joshua, We are your servants. In other words, we defer to you.
Mm-hmm.
Then Joshua said to them, Who are you, and where do you come from? By the way, you're going to find it very fascinating, the literal nature of what occurs when they say, We are your servants, as you're going to see what's going to happen. They didn't even realize how true this was going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Verse 9, And they said to him, Your servants have come from a very far country because of the fame of the Lord your God, for we have heard the report of him and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon, the king of Heshbon, and to Og, the king of Bashan, who was at Ashtaroth. Now, they travel, the Gibeonites, to Israel's base camp at Gilgal, where they first crossed the Jordan River. They talk with Joshua and the leaders of Israel. They, of course, act like they defer to them. They feign respect, and they explain that they have heard about the great accomplishments of the Lord in Egypt by taking them out through the Red Sea and conquering Pharaoh and his army, about on the other side of the river, about the battle against the giant king Sihon and the giant king Og, and how they defeated them. They know these things, and they tell Joshua, We've heard this. Now, what do they not mention, though, interestingly enough? Yes, that's true. And what battles do they not mention?
Jericho and Ai.
And why would they mention them?
Because that would mean they were close.
Mm-hmm.
So they selectively don't mention the victories at Ai and Jericho, because that would clearly give way that they had to have that information because they had to be close to it. They wouldn't have known that information if they'd been traveling from a long distance. So they're very selective about that. Now, I want you to notice in what we're going to study about the Gibeonites and things connected to them, the absolute consistency and accuracy of God's Word. Let me show you. Hold your place here in Joshua, but turn back all the way to the 10th chapter of Genesis. It is remarkable how God weaves his themes through the Bible, never forgetting and giving us information that is related to other information. So Genesis chapter 10, we're going to read verses 15 to 17. And Canaan became the father of Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusite, and the Amorite, and the Girgashite, and the Hivite, and the Archite, and the Sinite. So, therefore, Canaan, who is the grandson of
No.
Noah, okay? He has these relatives, and who do they become? The Jebusite, the Girgashite, the Amorite. They become the nations that they're now going against in, quote, the land of Canaan. It's called the land of Canaan, right? All right? The grandson of Noah. Now, turn back one chapter.
He was the one who was cursed.
Yes, that's what we're going to look at next.
Yeah.
Turn back one chapter to chapter 9. And we're going to look at verse 25. Now, I'm not going to go into all the reasons why he was cursed, because that would become a very long discussion, and it takes some effort to go into it and try to figure out why. At any rate, maybe at another point we'll go into that. But there's an act that occurs that's in violation of Noah. Okay, he disrespects Noah. Different people interpret how he disrespected him and why, but at any rate, he disrespected Noah. Okay, so verse 25. So verse 24. When Noah awoke from his wine, he had been drinking wine. He knew what his youngest son had done to him. And he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants." Where'd you hear that before? It's exactly what these people said to Joshua when they came with his deception. A servant of servants, he shall be his brother, he shall be to his brothers. 1,000 years later, this comes true. And in the events in Joshua's day, Canaan's people, the Canaanites, end up literally becoming the servants of the Jews, of Israel. Now, we see that also they become, in another time, it's reiterated that they become servants. You don't have to turn here, but it's found in 1 Kings 9, verses 20 and 21. They are subjected again to forced labor. You're going to see that they become forced laborers here. But it's a very interesting story. Now, I want you to notice in the story the contrast between two peoples. And that is the contrast between Rahab and her family and the Gibeonites. Let's go through some of the things that are comparisons and contrast to them. I will suggest to you that it's the contrast between the carnal individuals and the spiritual ones. But interestingly enough, the carnal ones are still spiritually redeemed. And I'm going to show you. Now, both Rahab and her family and here the Gibeonites are both born Canaanites, right? And are under the ban. But Rahab, because of her response to the truth of what she knew about the Lord, she in faith leans on the mercy of God and is preserved and even elevated in Israel. Remember what happens. She marries an interesting person. His name's Nahshon. He is a prince or leader of Israel. So she ends up becoming in an elevated position and elevated in another way too. You remember, we go through her genealogy and who eventually comes from her? Christ. Through Boaz and on and on. And Jesus finally is born as in the lineage The great grandmother is, interestingly enough, this prostitute woman, Rahab. It's a fascinating thing that God did. Now, the Gibeonites, instead of leaning on God's grace, they lean on deception. But they are also preserved, as Rahab and her family were preserved. But they're preserved in a different way. As servants.
Right.
They are dishonored as slaves of Israel because of what they did. Now, notice this. Both Rahab and the Gibeonites heard of what God did. And both of them confess the truth of what the God of Israel had done and who he is. The Gibeonites also, we must give to them credit that just like Rahab, they opposed their own culture and heritage by applying to Israel. They made themselves the enemies of the other Amorites by doing that, as Rahab herself made herself an enemy of the king of Jericho by confessing faith and, of course, helping out the two spies. True? So there's a similarity there. So the Gibeonites forsook their alliance with the other Canaanites, which put them, of course, in great danger. And we're going to see in the next chapter the level of danger that occurs. Literally, because they opposed the other Amorites, and because they made an alliance with Israel, these nations, these other Amorite nations, come to destroy them. This is chapter 10. And therefore, since Israel does make a covenant with them, what does Israel have to do? Has to protect them. And they enter into this completely bizarre battle that we're going to go into here in chapter 10. And it's bizarre. It's going to be very fun to kind of tear it apart. It's, of course, the battle where it says that day the sun stood still. Okay, and it creates some very interesting questions that we'll go into. Now, Rahab, the prostitute, entered national Israel honorably by faith. The Gibeonites, the liars, also entered national Israel, but not honorably, but rather through deception. As a result, of course, they are given a humble place. Joshua makes them, he declares that they will become hewers or cutters of wood for the tabernacle. We see that, turn back to Joshua here, in verse 23 of Joshua 9. After it's found out that they've deceived Israel and lied to Israel, in verse 23 Joshua says, "Now therefore you are cursed, and you shall never cease from being slaves, both hewers of wood and drawers of water." Now notice the next phrase. It's very interesting. It would be easy to overlook it. "For the house of my God." So they become hewers of wood and slaves and drawers of water, but in what particular way do they become hewers of wood?
Serving the temple?
Serving the tabernacle.
Of the tabernacle.
Now that is going to be a very interesting thing. Okay?
They were idolaters, right?
Yeah. Initially.
They must have resented that.
Yeah. Now let's look at how Gibeon has a very interesting place in history over the next hundreds and hundreds of years. I find it fascinating the references that we can dig out about Gibeon, because it tells us a story about them, and it tells us something about God and his spiritual work in people's lives. Okay? Now, when the land was finally divided among the tribes, okay, later on, each tribe, as they conquered the land, partially conquered it, it's the areas are separated out for territories. Judah gets this place, Reuben gets this place, Gad gets this place, Asher gets this place, okay? And you find that as the land is divided, Gibeon was given to the sons of Aaron and became a special city of the Lord. Where do we see that? Go over to Joshua chapter 21. Joshua 21. And we're going to read verse 17. And from the tribe of Benjamin, in other words, of their tribal area, their territory, Gibeon with its pasture lands and Geba with its pasture lands. So Gibeon becomes one of the 48 Levitical cities. All right? Now, do you understand? The Levites were not given a territory in Israel.
Right.
All the other tribes were given their territory, but the Levites, the priest tribe, was not given territory. They were given cities, 48 of them. And they were allowed for a distance of, 2,000 yards or something like that, outside of the city. They were allowed to have pasture immediately around the cities that they were given. And one of those Levitical cities becomes Gibeon. So it now has a very, very interesting status, doesn't it?
And who was working on the pastures?
Well, the Levites were allowed to have a certain amount of, sheep and lambs that they also could have too. Mm-hmm. But of course it was very limited compared to the other tribes. This is part of why also the Levites get a tenth of the tithe each year, is to help support them because they don't have the land that the 12 other 11 tribes do. Okay? Now, here's another interesting fact about Gibeon. 400 years later, David places the tabernacle at Gibeon, which means it takes on a special spiritual importance. Turn over to your right to 1 Chronicles, and let me show you. The book of 1 Chronicles, and we're going to go to chapter 16 of 1 Chronicles. And we're going to look at verse 39. It says, and he left Zadok, the priest, and his relatives, the priests, before the tabernacle of the Lord in the high place which was at Gibeon, to offer burnt offerings to the Lord on the altar of burnt offerings continually morning and evening, even according to all that is written in the law of the Lord, which he commanded Israel. So the Gibeonites, in their area, their town, is associated. The tabernacle comes into their town, and the priests service the tabernacle, and the Gibeonites are part of that activity. They're cutting the wood for the sacrifice on the altar that's being burned. They're part of the process now of literally making the sacrifices for the forgiveness of sins for Israel.
So they're kind of redneck.
Apparently. Now, it's also interesting, and we don't have to turn here, but one of David's most trusted, valiant warriors, we are told in 2 Samuel, is a Gibeonite. He's among his closest group of warriors. Now, it's also interesting to look at 1 Chronicles 6, since we're here at 1 Chronicles 6:17. Turn back to 1 Chronicles chapter 6, and there's another interesting reference. We're going to start in verse 54 of 1 Chronicles 6. It says in verse 54, now these are their settlements according to their camps within their borders, to the sons of Aaron of the families of the Korathites, for theirs was the first lot, to them they gave da-da-da-da-da. So there's this group of Levites, because remember Aaron had, I think, 3 sons, if I remember. Okay? And each one of them, of course, has families, and those families grow. And there are 3 different groups then that become Levitical priests, and one of them is called the Korathites. Now look at verse 60. Drop down from 54 to 60. And from the tribe of Benjamin, Geba, with its pasture lands, and it goes on and talks about this. Now, Geba is virtually almost identical in place with Gibeon. They're right together. Now, I want you to imagine something. If you were the Gibeonites over hundreds of years being part of national Israel, serving in the temple, working right along beside the Levitical priests, do you think there might be a chance that there was intermarriage that occurred?
What?
Well, let's put it this way: if it's hard to believe that, it's not hard to believe that there was intermarriage with Rahab and her family and relatives, because we know they had intermarriage with the Jews, and Christ came from that. I can't prove it, but I think over time, the Gibeonites intermarried with Israel, and they became even more involved then in the process of temple worship. Okay? Now, also we see another interesting thing here. When Solomon becomes king, he makes a burnt offering at Gibeon. And it's interesting what happens there. Turn from Chronicles back to 1 Kings. 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 4. This is at the very beginning of Solomon's taking over from David. 1 Kings 3, chapter 3, verse 4. And Solomon went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place, and Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on the altar. In Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night and said, "Ask what you wish me to give you." So here's the place in which Solomon asks for wisdom and leadership of Israel, and it occurs in a dream after he sacrificed in the tabernacle at Gibeon. Again, another memorable place. Now finally, we see that about 500 years later, during the return of the exile under Nehemiah, that the Gibeonites are mentioned again. Turn to Nehemiah, turn from Kings, Chronicles, and then go to Nehemiah and turn to chapter 3 of Nehemiah. Remember, the story here is that they've been released from Babylonian captivity. They were there for 70 years. They paid 70 years, 1 year for each of the 490 years that they had not kept the Shemitah year, the 7th year. So God says, okay, you're in timeout in Babylon for 70 years. At the end of the 70 years, Daniel realizes, as it's written in Jeremiah, that it's only going to be 7 years. And he goes, wow, in 3 years, we're getting out of here. So they are allowed to leave under King Cyrus. And he allows them, he gives them funding, he gives them papers and documents, and remarkably sends them back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and to rebuild the walls. Well, they start, of course, with the walls. They need some protection there. So in the 3rd chapter of Nehemiah, we see that, should be Nehemiah 3:7, okay? It says they're building the walls, talks about each group and what part of the wall they build. And in verse 7, next to them, Malphiah, the Gibeonite, and Jadon, and it goes on, and the men of Gibeon and Mizpah also made repairs for the official seat of the governor in the province beyond the river. So the Gibeonites are they're taken away in the Babylonian captivity, and they're part of the 50,000 or so that come back. And remember, there probably were 500,000 or more than that. They were in Babylon, 3/4, maybe 1 million, that were there for that 70 years, okay? But only 50,000 return. A very small percentage come back to Jerusalem. But of that percentage, who comes with him? The Gibeonites. Some of them. So they become literally connected in the most intimate way to Israel. Even though they start out as being slaves based on deception, they still are part of national Israel. Therefore, they benefit from national Israel. They receive the promises of national Israel, become a part of national Israel. I think they marry into national Israel. It's a very interesting story. Now, let's look at how does that apply to us? Yes, dear.
The initial reason for that, because they were willing to make peace with Israel.
Yes. They were. And if they hadn't made peace, what would have happened? They would have been annihilated.
But what if they hadn't promised not to destroy them? Would they have been destroyed then? Because
Yes.
that was God's original
Yes.
plan, right?
It's very interesting. We have two very interesting examples of how God seems to change his will based on the heart, attitude, or need, or even screw-ups of people. You know, Rahab should have been under the ban and should have been killed. She was a Canaanite. And yet she showed faith and helped the spies, and so she's saved. The Gibeonites are under the ban. Okay? They're obviously Canaanites. They're Hivites, literally. And yet God, instead of annihilating them, even though they're deceptive and they lie, okay? Of course, Rahab did too, didn't she? She was a liar also. All right? She
But
clearly.
But they both admitted Lord as
Yes.
they kind of.
Yes. And so they're pulled into national Israel despite that. Now, let's look at the application here. I want you to turn to the book of Romans.
Who was debating with the board about changing the decision? Moses?
Abraham debated with the Lord about Sodom and said, could we even 50, 40, 30? You know, there are many people that have, and God is relented at times.
Right.
God is not inflexible. He flexes to the heart, attitude, and need of people. Even though it's not in his overall plan, he still makes exceptions. And these are very interesting exceptions. Yes?
But if God knows everything, why would he make those absolute and then so-called changes not?
Because it still depends on the action of people. Rahab had to still choose to do what she did. If she wouldn't have chosen it, she would have been destroyed.
But he knew that she was going to.
That's true. Free will, predestination. Free will, predestination. Free will, predestination. Right?
I want to pick up on what you said that when Moses argued with God on Mount Sinai. If you really read the scripture, God says, paraphrasing, I have about half a mind to kill all those people that you, Moses, brought over here and have us camped out there. They're rebellion. They're got this golden calf thing go on. Period. New paragraph. Moses goes, hold on just a minute. They're your people. You're their God. You asked me to lead them here. They are yours, and you will take care of them. God goes, you got it, man. That's what I've been trying to teach you. They're my people. But if you put it side by side, God and Moses have a pretty good argument. God is building this parenthetical, I ought to just wipe them off. And Moses says, no, you don't.
Sorry.
My mother's update from my sister. She writes a text that comes in about 15 of them. But it's interesting because I put them side by side and just look at them.
Right.
Moses got his PhD in faith right there. He says, God, they're your people from day one. And God says, you're right.
He had this boldness.
He did. But he talked to God like we talk to our
Face to face.
Friend, like friend.
Yes. Romans 9. Interestingly enough, I'm going to start in verse 19, which is a discussion about free will versus predestination. Paul writes, "You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? And who resists his will?" Verse 20, "On the contrary, who are you, O man, who answers back to God? The thing molded will not say to the molder, why did you make me like this, will it?" Verse 21, "Or does not the potter have a right over the clay to make from the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for common use?" What if, verse 22, what if God, although willing to demonstrate his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction? Rahab was a vessel of wrath prepared for destruction. The Gibeonites were vessels of wrath prepared for destruction. We were vessels of wrath prepared for destruction. Verse 23, "And he did so in order that he might make known the riches of his glory upon vessels of mercy, which he prepared beforehand for glory. Even us," he says, verse 24, "whom he also called, not from among Jews only, but also from among Gentiles. As he says also in Hosea, I will call those who were not my people, my people." That was true of Rahab, true of the Gibeonites, and true of us. And her who was not beloved, I will call beloved. And it shall be that in that place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called sons of the living God. This is the mercy and love of God, even to people that were destined to destruction, but averted destruction.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
So Pharaoh, had he chosen to, through one of the plagues, turn to God, would that have changed that course? I mean, did he have that choice then?
I think he
No.
did.
No.
Well,
No.
you might say up to a point he did, and then after a point he didn't.
God hardened his heart.
He did.
God hardened his heart. God hardened his heart. God hardened
But
his heart.
had he no choice then, he was doomed to go to hell no matter what he did.
God was making an example. In the beginning, maybe he could have, but in the scripture, you look at the story, and God hardened Pharaoh's heart.
Once he initially rejected God.
Well, it's still, he was treating his family, his people, wrongly. It held them captive. They'd been slaves. They wouldn't let them worship. God was saying, I'm making an example out of you, boy, and I'm making an example to the rest of the world when they see what I do to you. So, didn't mean to argue with the teacher, but it's really clear on.
Yeah. The problem, again, remember, free will versus predestination is always an enigma for us because we are in time and God is outside of time. He can see the beginning from the end, the first from the last, and it's all the same for him. All right? We don't view it that way because we're caught in time. Now, again, I'm going to share one of the great examples. Chuck Missler talks about this, and he says, It's like walking through a great doorway, and posted in front of it is, "Come thou who wilt." All who are welcome. Choose freely. Come on in. And as you walk through the doorway, and you turn around and you look at the back of the same doorway, it says, "Chosen before the foundation of the world." Okay? It's an enigma to us, but it's all the same to God. He knows the beginning from the end. He knows what the heart of each person will do.
Can we say Pharaoh was predestined to be the part of God's plan, and therefore he basically didn't have a choice?
Well,
But God
Maybe.
already knew ahead of time what he would have done anyway.
yes.
That's where the foreknowledge comes from.
Yes.
He knew what the choice was going to be.
So therefore, he wasn't being unjust by hardening his heart because he already knew that Pharaoh probably would reject him.
Remember what was said in Romans 9. There's vessels of wrath and vessels of mercy. And who shall say to the potter about the lump of clay, "Why did you make this one this way, and why did you make that one that way?"
I think it's pretty intense.
It is.
To think about that, like, well, that almost feels like God he can do whatever he wants. Right?
He can, but at the same time, what does he do? What he does is in the best interest of each person. He makes vessels of mercy. Okay? Notice, again, let's finish this in Romans 9. Let's read verses 30 through 32. What shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness, they had no interest in God. They were pursuing idolatry. They were worshiping these demigods over and over again, culture after culture, okay? He says that Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness attained righteousness, even the righteousness which is by faith. But Israel, pursuing a law of righteousness, that is the Mosaic law, okay, did not arrive at that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as it were, by works. They stumbled over the stumbling stone. So here's the great irony. Israel is given the law which represents the nature of God and the will of God, but because they turned it into something that it was never meant to really be, they never benefited from it, and therefore did not gain righteousness through it. Where the Gentiles, who had no interest in righteousness, okay, basically, finally opened their hearts to righteousness and were saved through faith. It's a great, interesting irony, isn't it, that occurs?
And Rahab being an example.
Rahab and the Gibeonites being examples. And turn to one more thing in the New Testament. Turn over to your right to 1 Corinthians 1 from Romans 9 here. I think we need to read these verses. 1 Corinthians 1, starting in verse 26. For consider your calling, brethren, that there were not many wise according to the flesh, not many of you mighty, not many noble, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things which are strong, and the base things of the world and the despised things, like Rahab the prostitute and the Gibeonites, the liars and deceivers. God has chosen the things that are not, and that he might nullify the things which are, that no man should boast before God. For by his doing you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God and righteousness and sanctification and redemption. that just as is written, let him who boasts, boast in the Lord. It's purely by the mercy of God. It doesn't matter what you are before you accept in faith. It matters what you become. You can be lowly and you'll become elevated. Or you can be great according to the world's standard and have to be humbled, like Pharaoh. So, very interesting, I think, about the Gibeonites, don't you? So let's finish this. We'll finish this section, this part. We're not going to finish the whole chapter, but let's go back to Joshua.
Just like God chose the Israelites, and Jerusalem where he places his name, not for any particular reason, but he chose them.
Right. Yeah. And he says, who are you that I chose you? In other words, you didn't merit it, you didn't cause it. It's not like you were great people that I should, pay attention to you, but rather he chose them to work through them. So, verses 11 through 15 of Joshua 9, let's read them. It says, so, our elders and all the inhabitants of our country spoke to us, saying, take provisions in your hand for the journey and go and meet them and say to them, we are your servants. Now then, make a covenant with us. This our bread was warm when we took it from our provisions out of our houses on the day that we left to come to you. But now, behold, it is dry and has become crumbled. And these wineskins which we filled were new, and behold, they are torn. And these our clothes and our sandals are worn out because of our very long journey.
Very dramatic.
Very dramatic.
Very ultra.
So the men of Israel, now here's the key, verse 14. So the men of Israel took some of their provisions and did not ask for the counsel of the Lord. Thus Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the leaders of the congregation swore an oath to them. In other words, they gave them a treaty. Now, so, these envoys come from Gibeon. They present the evidence of their long journey to the elders of Israel. The elders of Israel look at all this stuff, the sandals, the clothes, the baggage, the wineskins, and they conclude, yeah, they really look old. So it must be true that they traveled from a long way. But they don't consult the Lord. Now, turn back finally again to the New Testament. And I want you to look at two verses before we close. I want you to go first to 2 Corinthians 5. It's a very famous verse, but worth reading in this instance. And then we're going to go to Hebrews chapter 11. 2 Corinthians 5. And it's verse 7. For we walk by faith and not by sight. In other words, sight at times will deceive you. Sight will give an impression of what is not spiritually true. Sight will give you evidence, but not necessarily the will of God. We're all deceived by sight. We like to reason through things. We like to build a case of logic. Okay? I'm absolutely guilty of this. Okay? This is the way my mind works. But what we need to do in every circumstance is to say, all right, Lord, despite what it looks like, what is the truth here? What is your will? What do you really want me to do, even if it seems contrary to the evidence? What do you want me to do?
It's like I married you.
Right, exactly. Exactly. Contrary to all reason, you married me.
Yeah.
It's true. It's true.
Well, there's so much left in the bank.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, finally, turn to Hebrews chapter 11 from 2 Corinthians. Back to Hebrews 11. our famous chapter about faith. And we're reminded in verse 6 of Hebrews 11. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. Underline that verse in your Bible. There's a few verses in your Bible that should absolutely be underlined. This is one of them. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. He honors faith, not necessarily works. All right? For without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, that God is the existent one, okay, that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who look at the evidence. No, who seek him, right? Who seek him. So this should be our New Year's resolution. Okay? It's time in each thing that we do to seek God. And despite what our plans are, despite what the evidence is, despite what seems logical or rational, we should say, okay, Lord, what do you want? What do you want me to do? What is your will here? The Gibeonites deceived them, the Jews, because they didn't seek the counsel of the Lord. We're going to be deceived if we don't also seek the counsel of the Lord. And it's hard to do sometimes. We get on a roll, We get on a roll. Oh, this must be true. That must be true. So-and-so and such and such,
Well, there's humanness of it that, we don't bother God. We just, we're intelligent people.
We can do it. All right, we'll take over. So, we conclude here in verse 15, the treaty is made, an agreement is made, an oath is given, it's a done deal. And we come from what we went over about the Gibeonites and how we find them through history, we can see, indeed, it was a done deal. Once the deal was made, it's permanent. All right? So, then we'll have to wait for next week to see how it all turns out. So we'll finish out the chapter, and we'll start on this very, very, very interesting chapter 10, about the day that the sun and the moon stood still in their orbit.
Is this a nerdy chapter?
Oh, it's a nerd chapter. I really like this one.
Yeah.
Because I get to get into science, physics, astronomy, the motion of the moon, the apparent motion of the earth in relationship, and a very, very interesting thing that I'll try to show you evidence of, that not only does Joshua say in the text that the apparent sun seemed to apparently not set for a period of time when it normally would have, and its apparent normal motion did not occur. Daylight was extended. But I will show you evidence in cultures around the world that they talk about the same thing happening, depending on which side of the earth you're on. If you're on the opposite side of the earth, they talk about the long night. And if you're on this side of the earth, they talk about the long day. That's very interesting evidence. Oh, yeah. China. Yeah. So we'll build the evidence for the truth of Joshua 10. All right. Let's close with a word of prayer. You have something you want to say first?
Let's pray, then I'll do it.